Hello everybody, my name is Michael Hicks. I'm an independent game designer and musician. Lately I've been working on a game called The Path of Modus, but a few years back in 2015 I put out a game called Pillar for PlayStation 4, Steam, and Xbox. Pillar and The Path of Modus were both made by a team of two, my friend Gonzalo Antunes and myself. And around the time Pillar came out, I started getting some people here and there reaching out to me, asking for information on how they can get into games as well. Pillar did pretty well for a small little indie game. We got some nice press coverage at places like Game Informer magazine, and I think we're at over 320,000 players so far. And even though I'm very proud of that game, and I'm hoping The Path of Modus can surpass that, I feel like a lot of times when we're looking at other people's story, or we're looking at a page of someone else's book, so to speak, all we see are these highlights, and we never seem to focus on all of the failures and failed projects that have led up to a certain point. And I found that the key information that I want to share with people about how they can get into games as well basically comes through by sharing my own story and all of the bumps I hit along the road to get to this point. So I'm going to take you guys back to when I was in grade school, first learning to make games, and we'll go all the way up until the present day today. But before we jump into that, I want to give you a quick intro about me. I'm 24 years old, and I've been making art for around 19 years. I'm a self-taught programmer, designer, musician, sound effect designer. I even do the marketing and promotion. I generally only work with an artist. And in this 24 years of life that I've had, I've made 9 video games, 15 albums, several short films, and a few other things as well. I stumbled into pursuing games as a career when I was 18, so this wasn't my intention to do this as a full professional career. I just was interested in doing this as a hobby, and then I kind of stumbled into doing it full time, I guess you could say. And usually when I tell people that my first published video game came out when I was 18 for Xbox 360, usually they're like, oh wow, that's crazy, you're really young to be doing that. But like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we're not seeing the full story of things. I had an advantage, and my advantage was my dad. He was into computers from the very beginning, and he was in a band, so he had a lot of recording equipment lying around the house, and guitars, and things like that. So when I was 5 years old, I was around all this equipment, and I would kind of experiment and play around with it. And being around these things and experimenting, recording little tapes of me playing music at, 5 years old, even though I didn't know what I was doing, all this stuff has transferred over to what I do today. So I benefited greatly from that, and I'm thankful to have that advantage. But I still think that anyone can do what I've done, especially in this technology era that we live in. I think all you need to make games today is a computer, an internet connection, and a lot of motivation. And that last point is probably the most important one. But let's go ahead and go back to the early grade school years when I was first learning to program games. In early grade school, I was doing various creative things. I had this little camera, and I would run around my backyard filming my cats, making super cat movies, I'd call them. And I was also making some music, and I wanted to put all this stuff up on a website. So I started using GeoCities. This was a popular web editor back in the 90s to make small little websites for my work. In GeoCities, there were some pre-made games that you could drag and drop onto your website. One of them was Tic-Tac-Toe, and if you double-clicked on the game, you could see some of the code underneath, and you could mess around with it and see how it was working. And this was my first experience with code, okay? I was just getting my feet wet, nothing too crazy. And then in 4th through 6th grade, I started finding things online, like little tutorials and samples of code, and I would rearrange these things to make my own game, quote unquote. It wasn't really my game, I was just using other people's stuff, but it was another step forward. After this, XNA was announced, and XNA is a toolkit that lets anyone make a video game for Xbox 360. And at the time, this was unheard of. It was amazing. Like, wow, anyone can make an Xbox 360 game now? I have to do that. Like, I was so amped up. So this was my big dream. I was going to make a game for Xbox 360. I bought a book on how to program in XNA, and in 7th grade I tried to make an XNA game, but I failed. Right? I Couldn't figure it out. The book I had bought was way over my head. It assumed I had a background in computer science, which I didn't. And I started to wonder that, maybe I'm not smart enough to make video games. I don't understand any of this stuff. Maybe I'm not meant to do this. But luckily, I took a step back. I said, okay, let's find a book out here that's more geared towards my level. And after doing some Google searches, I found a book called Game Programming for Teens. And I learned a ton from this book. This book was definitely geared more towards my level. And after going through that book and doing some samples in it, I used what I learned in 8th grade to make my very first game, Cube Wars. And this was just a basic 2D space shooter, nothing too crazy. You're probably looking at the picture thinking, wow, that's nothing. That looks like you made it in 5 minutes. But you're wrong. It actually took me a long time, and it was really hard for me to make this game. This was a huge barrier right here. And once I finally finished it, I was very proud of myself for doing it. And even though this was my first experience with game development, I already started to take some things away from it. I found that the process of working on a game was very magical or even spiritual. I kind of felt like a god, designing these worlds and programming these characters that would behave a certain way. That was really cool, and it made me want to work on another game. And I also discovered that I love being confused by things and then trying to understand them. I love that moment when you've been confused by something, but maybe a few weeks later or a few months later, that light bulb finally turns on. That's such a great, gratifying moment. And a lot of times when I talk to people that are working on their first game or trying to learn programming, they'll run into something that they don't quite understand and they give up. And that's the thing. You will run into things that you don't understand, but you can't give up. You have to keep going and work through it, and eventually you will understand. And also, maybe the most important lesson I started to learn was no one really pat me on the back for making this game. There wasn't a huge over-enthusiastic response. And even when I showed this game in front of a class I had in high school, many people thought I was lying when I said I made this game. They didn't believe me. And that's an important lesson because I feel like when you're doing this type of work, you should be making games because you want to make them. Because you're in love with the creative process or you want to see this idea come to life. As soon as you start expecting things like praise or money, I think you'll become disappointed. Because everyone that's been successful, they have these types of setbacks, you know what I mean? And they have to be motivated by something other than these external things to get through all of it. Otherwise, if you're just wanting praise and you get none, you'll probably stop making games, you know what I mean? So after working on this game, I had a dream. And my dream was I wanted to make a 3D space shooter similar to Star Wars Rogue Squadron, a game I grew up playing, and release it on Xbox 360 using XNA. There were some problems though. To make a 3D game requires an understanding of some pretty complex math. And the grade school teacher that I went to for help wasn't really able to help me. On top of that, I didn't know how to program in C#. The Game Programming for Teens book uses a language called Blitz Plus, and Blitz Plus doesn't work on Xbox 360. And finally, I knew that the programming knowledge I had was way too attached to the book. I needed to challenge myself on my own and make some more projects to get more experience making games. So that was basically my solution to all these problems. I kept making games in Blitz Plus on my own to become a better programmer. So notice I didn't go straight for that dream game. And a lot of times I see new people come in, they want to make their first game, and they'll say something like, yeah, let's make a 3D MMORPG, or something hugely ambitious. And you can't really do that. You have to start small and work your way up to these bigger games. So I made 2 games around this time. The first one was called Spiky, which was a basic game where you go around the screen dodging spikes that are falling down. And the second game was pretty cool. It was a 2D RPG called Knight's Realm. It had maybe 11 or 12 quests, nothing too crazy. But that was a big challenge for me, and I felt like it pushed myself as a programmer. I spent a lot of late nights working on it, and I was really excited when it was finally done. And for Knight's Realm, I enlisted some help from freelance artists on GameDev.net. I basically said, hey, I'm trying to make a game to get experience. Would you want to make art for this game to get experience? They said, yeah. And after all of this, I felt ready to work on my first XNA project. And my first XNA project was called Cube Wars 2. It was a 2D space shooter, a sequel to Cube Wars 1, obviously. But unfortunately, I lost this project. I have nothing from it, not even a picture, because my computer crashed. So that's an important thing to take away. Always back up your work. So for the rest of 2008 to early 2010, I played in a band. So basically my passion was in music at this time, and I didn't work on any more games. But after the band broke up, I felt motivated to come back and work on my dream 3D space shooter game. And I learned the math by studying examples online. Basically, I'd find samples of, it would be like a 3D ship flying around in an open space. I would take that, I would go through the code, and line by line, I would remove one line and see, okay, what does this do? Then fire up the program. I'd see, okay, when I remove this line, I can't accelerate anymore. So I know what that means. And then I would go back and try another line. And I would just keep repeating that until I understood what the entire thing was doing. It was really tedious, but it worked. And eventually, after 6 months, I finished my dream game in 2010. But unfortunately, to release it on Xbox 360, you have to be 18 legally. And I was only 17 at the time, so I had to wait a little bit. But on my 18th birthday, I released Honor and Vengeance for Xbox 360. And I didn't really expect anything when I put this up. I just thought it would be cool to make an Xbox game and say it was on the marketplace, you know what I mean? But to my surprise, around 6,000 people downloaded the game and played it. And I sent out some press releases, not expecting anything, but again, to my surprise, people started reaching out, wanting to interview me. I was on a few podcasts. The newspaper in my town here wrote a story about me, and that was really awkward. I mean, I had no experience doing public speaking. I was really nervous, and I stuttered a lot. But just like the other skills I'm talking about in this video, public speaking is a skill, and at first you're not too good at it, but eventually you do it enough, and you get better and improve. And as for the game, it was rough. I'm not particularly proud of the game looking back, but some people liked it, and that was cool to see people's reaction to it. And at this point, I started to realize that maybe this could be a real career for me. I mean, I just threw this up and I had this type of results. So what would happen if I put all of my effort into making video games? So I quit my summer job. I was working at a grocery mart at the time to work on a sequel to Honor and Vengeance. And this wasn't a very popular decision at home. Imagine telling your parents that you're quitting your job to work on video games in your bedroom. My dad basically told me that it was a waste of time and I wouldn't go anywhere with it, but I had seen results and I just really believed in what I was doing. So I kept on going, and in around 6 or 7 months I released Honor and Vengeance 2 for Xbox 360. And this game was better received than the original. We had a lot more press attention. There was a website called GameTrailers.com that was pretty big back in the day, and they featured our trailer on the front page. Kotaku had an end-of-the-year roundup post, and they mentioned Honor and Vengeance 2. But most importantly, I feel like I really solidified my programming chops working on this game. I felt very comfortable programming in 2D, in 3D. I felt comfortable debugging my code, figuring out what was wrong with it. But at this point, I started to question things from the design side. Because, you know, at the time, I actually kind of thought that programming a game and designing a game are the same thing. And that's not true. They're totally different fields and almost require a totally different skill set. So around this time, I left for college, and don't feel like you have to go to college to do this type of stuff. I just went because I wanted the degree as a backup, but it just depends what you want out of it, you know. And during college, I started questioning a lot of things about my work and about game design in general. And the first thing I started to ask was, what can I make besides space shooters? Because if you look at my games, a lot of them have been space shooters, and I want to challenge myself and branch out a bit. And then I started to ask, what can I do that big studios can't do? Because if you look at the Honor and Vengeance games, my selling point, or why I thought they were unique, was that they were kind of rivaling AAA studios with these 3D graphics. In my mind, I was making a budget AAA game for people. And the reality is that I can't really compete with the big studios when it comes to graphics and technology, right? They have such manpower and knowledge at these studios that it really isn't realistic. So what can I do that makes me stand out? What makes me unique as a game designer? And then I started to ask, why are most games about killing people? So many games in this industry are somehow based around violence, and it made me kind of wonder, is this all that games are good at? Can games maybe do more meaningful things? So I got frustrated with video games around this time, and I think part of it was because I was surrounding myself with music and film that was changing my perspective on things in life. So I started playing experimental games. There was some stuff by Jason Rohrer, who made a game called Passage, and another game called Gravitation. Both of them I found very inspiring. He was thinking about these things that I was thinking about. And eventually I emerged from this period of questioning with a new approach to game design. And my approach was basically that all games teach something subconsciously through their design. All games communicate things while you're interacting with the mechanics. And not just educational games. Even a game like Mario, if you think about it, when you first fire up Mario, you see that Goomba, and you probably run into him and die. And then you say in your mind, oh, okay, I can't hit the Goomba, that's not good, he kills me. So then maybe eventually you try some other things, and you jump on the Goomba, and that kills him. And then you say, oh, okay, if I hit the Goomba, that's bad, but if I jump on him, that's good. So in a way, the story starts to build up in your mind. Ideas are being communicated through the interactions. And to me, I felt like I could communicate a story or at least interesting or meaningful ideas through these interactions. And I found that a lot of times in narrative games, the narrative isn't working too well because what the gameplay mechanics are communicating are often in conflict with what the story is trying to say. So think about if we're playing a first-person shooter and something sad has just happened in the story. You're talking to a computer character and he's giving you a voiceover about how sad he is, and there's some sad music playing. But meanwhile, as a player, we have the controller in our hands and we can start jumping up and down and firing our gun up in the air, and it just turns into comedy, you know what I mean? Like, we're over there jumping up and down, the guy's still like crying and the sad music's playing and stuff. And it just feels really clumsy, you know? And I feel like a lot of game designers don't really think about things in these terms. So I decided that I would make a game that approached the design in this way. I wanted to convey a story through the gameplay mechanics. And in 3 or 4 months, I made a game called Sententia. And in Sententia, you play as this little goblin guy, and he's from a village that's been trapped inside of a forest for hundreds of years. No one's found a way out, but he thinks he'll be the first one to do it by building these bridges through the forest. But in between building, he runs into bullies that stop him with their own words. So there's a verbal combat system where they're firing words at you and you have to fire words back. And I picked these mechanics for a specific reason. There was a message I was trying to convey through them. And even in the specific level design, each area is about a specific idea that I'm trying to communicate through the interactions. And this game was part of a promotion called the Indie Games Uprising 3. And basically this was a promotion where indie developers joined forces to promote their games together. I helped coordinate it, and we did pretty well. We had coverage from almost every major video game website, and I learned a lot about marketing and promotion at this time. I feel like a lot of indie developers think that if you just put your game up on the marketplace, people will come and see it, but that's not true. As an indie developer, we wear many hats, and one of the hats we have to learn about is marketing and promotion. So I worked with Microsoft on this event as well, and we eventually had a big promotion on the front page of Xbox Live. Here's a picture of it here. Notice that's Sententia on the main banner. Around 30,000 people downloaded Sententia and played it, but unfortunately it was largely rejected by most people. Not a lot of people liked the game, but what I found was that most of the feedback was toxic and not very constructive. So a lot of the times when I would read feedback from gamers or reviews, they would be making fun of me or saying, you know, this game sucks, this guy will never make a good game, he's really pretentious, this controls like crap, this game sucks, you know, that type of stuff. And that doesn't really do much for me, you know what I mean? And it was so much attention on me, I kind of had a mental breakdown. I turned off the computer, I had to go in my closet, I closed the door and I just kind of sat there and zoned out, because that was my mind's way of dealing with what was going on. There were a lot of eyes on me, and this was a big failure. And, you know, personally, I felt the game was flawed. It obviously wasn't, you know, the greatest thing. I'd only worked on it for 3 or 4 months, but I also felt like it did some things right. I saw a small group of people post their thoughts about the game, and a few people would post really detailed feedback about what they took away from the game. And it would be very specific things that, honestly, I wasn't sure people would pick up on, but these people did. And it was like, wow, I'm onto something here. I know I'm onto something. I see a few people get it. Most people don't like it at all, but I think there's something here. So at this point, I basically stepped away from the game development scene for a little bit. I got off Twitter and everything, and I kept reading the reviews over and over, trying to make sense of what went wrong with this game. But I was kind of confused, you know. I wondered if maybe I wasn't being honest with myself. Maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe I don't have what it takes to be a good game designer. But eventually, after a few months of analyzing all of this stuff, I decided that my mistake was in the surface level presentation. I made a lot of novice mistakes. You know, it didn't feel good to run around as the character. It felt really clunky. There were a lot of jumps that were hard to make, and it was really frustrating. But I was inspired by what went right, and, you know, I decided I would learn from what went wrong, and I would keep working on games and trying to explore this idea I had about game design farther. And I'm not sure how many people would continue making games at this point. You know, I'll never forget when I was in the closet, I just felt like I had blown away everything I had worked so hard to build up. I thought that even if I did make a good game again, no one would want to play it because I just ruined my reputation or something. You know what I mean? It was hard for me to deal with. But I kept going, and at this time I started working on a game called Pillar. And Pillar is a collection of mini games where each game represents a different personality type we find in people. So if you're an introverted character, the gameplay mechanics for the introverts are kind of stealthy. You only have so much energy, and if you're around other characters for too long, your energy starts to drain. And all these personality kinks come through by interacting and playing as the character. There's no story, no dialogue, no narrative. All these ideas come through the gameplay. And I started working on this in August 2012. After I graduated college, I moved back home and worked on it full time. I originally was trying to release the game for Xbox One, but due to some technical code issues, the game wouldn't run there. You know, as always, there's problems with every project you embark on, but luckily I ran into a friend at GDC who recommended I talk to Sony because my code base would work on PS4. I emailed Sony and I gave them a copy of the game. They were a big fan, and they signed me on as an official PlayStation developer. And basically at this point, it was just pure grinding. I worked 12-hour days for 7 days a week. I barely left the house for like 6 or 7 months. I basically learned that you can't do that. You have to manage your work hours a little better, you know, or else you burn yourself out. But I was really passionate about it, and I felt like I had something to prove after the whole thing with Sententia. And eventually, in February 2015, Pillar was released. It had a very hate it or love it response, but the love it people really dug it. There was some really great feedback on it, and around 320,000 people have downloaded the game and played it. We had some great press. Game Informer magazine had an article talking about examples of innovation in the video game industry, and they picked out 4 games that they thought were good examples, and Pillar was one of them. And probably most importantly, I found my voice as a game designer. I'm still very proud of many aspects in this game, but similar to Sententia, I was so obsessed with the ideas behind the gameplay. You know, what will the player think if this happens? What will the player think if that happens? I was so much in that world that I neglected the surface level presentation. There was so much intense puzzle solving in the game. It would have been nice to have more of a flow to it. Maybe you solve a few puzzles and do something else for a little bit. But as always, you take away these things and learn from them for the next project. So after Pillar came out, I started prototyping 3 different projects. One of them was a ground-up remake of Sententia called The Path of Modus, and it basically took Pillar's design approach and pushes it even farther. we felt called to work on this game full time, mainly because, for me, it felt appropriate to work with these themes again after my experience with releasing Pillar. I feel like I have a proper ending for the game, and even though it's been in development for 2 years, super long time, I'm very proud of this game. I feel like I finally realized the vision I originally had for it back in 2012. We're planning on releasing it as of recording this video in 2018, and I can't wait to see people's reaction to it. And that's basically the story up until today. In terms of key takeaways for why I've got this far, or why I've survived this long, I guess you could say. First, I've never expected anything in return for making my games. I just love making them. Similar to what I talked about earlier, if I would have came into this with the mindset of, oh, I'm going to make $1 million, or, oh, I'm going to get a 100 on Metacritic, or something like that, I think I would have stopped making games a long time ago. And don't take my word for this. Go and look at the stories of people who have had financial success in indie games. 9 times out of 10, if not all times, they're more into the creative process. And the money and all that is a byproduct. Next, I learned how to interpret criticism in a way that didn't sacrifice my vision. So if I would have listened to all those people when Sentintia came out that said, oh, this game sucks, this guy will never make a good game, if I would have listened to that, Pillar wouldn't have happened, the Path of Modus wouldn't happen. But that's not to rule out those people either. There's a reason why so many people had the response that they did to that game. But just understand that you're not always going to get specific feedback about what exactly they didn't like about it. You will have to take in all the information and kind of discern for yourself what feedback should be listened to, what feedback should be ignored, and how to appropriately address the feedback in a way that's right for your vision. Hopefully that makes sense. And it's a hard skill to learn, but I also think it's very important for indies to learn this skill. And finally, most importantly, I found my own voice as a game designer. Nothing is like Pillar, and nothing is like the Path of Modus. And that's why so many people wanted to play Pillar, and that's why so many people wrote about Pillar and so on. It's because it was unique, and it stood out in the crowd. So I want to say one last thing, and that is that you can do this as well. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not special. I think anyone can do the things that I've done, especially in this technology era that we live in. All the info that you need is online. And I'm going to be starting a YouTube channel, actually, and I will be sharing everything that I've learned throughout the years to make these games. I'll be talking about programming, design, marketing, business, you name it. Even if you've never programmed before, I have an Intro to Programming video series to get you on board. So listen, if you're even remotely interested in game development, you should subscribe to my channel. You can get there by going to pathofmodus.com, and yeah, you know, you can follow your dreams. All you need is a passion, and if you follow that passion, you'll be successful. And there will be people that say you can't do it, that you're wasting your time. There will be times where you feel like you can't do it. But if you have that passion and you love what you do, that will see you through all of that stuff and get you to where you need to be. And I know that a lot of people think it's naive to say, if you just follow your passion, you'll be successful. But there's a lot of different definitions of success. And success to me is just finishing a game, getting it out to the world, and having people play it. And in that sense, yes, I believe anyone can be successful. So good luck, don't give up, and I hope to see you all soon.